Okay, so in part two of the lecture, I'm going to outline the basic ideas of Marx and Weber when it comes to class, and kind of go into more specificity, I think, from Mitch's great introduction to the kind of founding fathers from the earlier on in the course. So, class, therefore, we're kind of thinking about class in terms of a social theory that helps us explain how inequality works, and not just how it kind of works, but how it's maintained and how some people benefit over others. So classes is helpful for that kind of basic who benefits sociological imagination kind of critical question. So kind of Durkheimian functionalist kind of side of things see at least a small level of inequality as necessarily functional. The idea that it motivates individuals to succeed. This is kind of similar to some of the liberal capitalist kind of dominant belief systems. But even in the kind of that model, too much inequality is bad. So the kind of that functionalist side aren't kind of advocating for kind of the extreme inequality we have now, but the idea that some inequality is kind of necessary for people to have something to grasp and achieve. For Marx, work is about exploitation, alienation. And Weber kind of takes this and kind of then brings more cultural aspects to this kind of economic Marxist system, and shows how culture and ideas play just as important part in class relations as the economic relations. And I'll talk about Bourdieu in part 3. So Marx's theory of capital basically highlights the shift from a feudal society from the Industrial Revolution into a capitalist society. He sees this kind of huge epochal transformation as a kind of struggle between workers and capitalists, and between workers themselves and between capitalists themselves sometimes too. Here, capitalism means constant growth to create profit, a constant need to create new markets, and you can see, as I've spoken about in previous weeks, the rise of digital relations of production has been a good example of this. The constant need to keep wages down. Cheaper wages mean there's always increased competition. There's a need here for some unemployment. Unemployment is seen as a good thing for capitalists. It keeps wages down. It allegedly makes people work harder. So importantly here, Marx sees class not just as a description of people in a system. It is the system by which we live in. It describes the key relations that drive the capitalist mode of production. So, in terms of society and its need to kind of survive and to continue, and for people themselves to be able to do that, people need to be productive. But Marx saw that the push towards industrialization and technology means that what we end up doing is producing more stuff than humans actually need to survive. And from this relation, those that own the means of production take off that extra stuff that's produced as profit and keep it for themselves. This is what he referred to as surplus value. So capitalist societies in this sense have a means of production, and in capitalist society that's the kind of the factories, the farms, everything that's kind of needed to make the things that we need to live by, and increasingly in consumer society to make the things that we want in terms of our leisure and entertainment. For Marx, these people are the capitalists, the ruling class, or the bourgeoisie. They're a kind of minority, the kind of rich, powerful minority. Then there's a majority, which is basically everyone else. What do you call the working class, the proletariat? These are people that all they have to be able to survive is to be able to sell their own labour. They don't own anything, so they have to kind of work to survive, to eat, to pay the rent. They have no other means other than work than to be able to survive in society. So these two classes, the bourgeoisie capitalists or ruling class versus the working class proletariat, are defined by the relationship to the means of production. That is, they either own it or they don't. Marx sees this relationship between the two classes as being inherently exploitative. Exploitation here refers to the idea that though the workers do all the stuff basically to make the things that society needs to continue, and they make more than it actually needs, the surplus, but they don't need to get to keep any of that excess. That kind of gets siphoned off to the capitalists, who then get to kind of be rich and make profit based on the exploitation of that labour. So you can see here Marx thinks that owning property, is a key form of inequality. Much of the laws and ideologies that we therefore live by are about protecting property as the means to which things are made and the means to which power is kind of disseminated through. So Marx has this kind of base superstructure model. It's a kind of spiral pattern where the kind of base is the key to how power works, the ownership of the means of production, tools, machines, factories, land, raw materials. In today's society, information, platforms, data. There's relations of production that goes on within the base. And then the superstructure, which is other kind of cultural, institutional things, are kind of set up in the kind of, I suppose, mirror image of the base. So through this notion, things like law, media, politics, science, education, art, family, culture, religion, philosophy, the norms of those things are all set up through capitalist ideology that essentially maintain this kind of unequal relationship. So the law, property is 9/10 of the law. The media is owned by the capitalists, and therefore it promotes promotes business ideology. Politics tends to kind of favour the, making policies that advantage the more privileged, and so on. So this is a kind of base superstructure model where the means of production, the economic base of how things are made, is the key driver of all the other things that happen in the world. Culture, ideas are all kind of through that ideological prism. So this two-class system, the owners and means of production. So you can see this is a relatively simplistic relation. There's kind of just two groups. And as future kind of class theorists have pointed out, there's kind of many more meaningful groups than this. But overall, Marx sees this as the key relations. For instance, managers in a big company aren't really the ruling class. They're still kind of salaried workers, but they still obviously then gain a fair bit of advantage in this system as opposed to, the workers that are down below. But they can be kind of sacked at any time. They still only have their labour to sell, even though they might be getting paid hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars or whatever. So there's a kind of a real stark difference here between the kind of two things, the capitalists and the workers. The working class, the proletariat, everyone has to work for wages. Marx essentially calls them wage slaves. And he predicted that the ruling class would grow richer, and that's certainly been the case, and that they would do this by forcing workers to work for as little as possible for kind of subsistence wages. Now, throughout time, the cost of living in relation to wages kind of goes up and down. And we seem to be moving back towards subsistence levels. Cost of living now is out of control. It means now that something like to be able to kind of affordably rent in cities like Sydney, you have to be earning about 130 grand a year, which, as in the previous lecture, puts you probably in the top 2% of earners. And by affordable, that means paying less than 30% of your weekly income in rent. Cost of living is kind of increasingly out of control at the moment, and it's kind of moving towards this kind of subsistence idea, I think. Buying a house in Australia is increasingly impossible unless you have kind of wealthy parents, or at least not so wealthy parents that are also willing to sacrifice a lot of their own wealth to help you out. So again, this has gone up and down. In the 70s, there was a kind of higher wages to cost kind of level. But at the moment, we seem to be moving towards what some of the things that Marx predicted. Importantly for this relation and what it means to be a human, a key notion here is alienation. Marx argued that the move to kind of industrialised societies, as we move off the feudal system into kind of, from a kind of rural production through to urban factories, it means that people would be increasingly estranged from their labour and would feel this kind of sense of alienation. Now, what he means there is that Say before things were industrialised and technology was used to make things, just say you were a maker of a chair, you would probably, go and get the wood, you would shape the wood into shape, you would make the chair from a tree into an actual chair. As technology changes and puts people on a production line, this means that things happen in factories. So while there was people still in these productions, you would probably just stick the leg on a chair and then it would move on to the next person to do something else. You don't get to kind of be creative, you're just kind of a cog in the machine in that sense. Obviously, as technologies advance more, people are increasingly kind of jettisoned from the systems as a whole. But in terms of the Industrial Revolution that Marx was talking about, this would lead the worker to be alienated. They're alienated from the things they make, they're alienated from control over like how things are made, and they're increasingly kind of left to be kind of Autobots, just kind of making things automatically rather than having the ability to express their creativity through their work. For Marx, this means that the capitalist worker would be increasingly alienated from their own product and have this kind of feeling of kind of alienation in their day-to-day life, of worthlessness, of depression, of anxiety. So importantly here, though, this alienated, exploited worker is the key way that the value is created in capitalism. Unlike kind of classical economics that some of you might be studying as well, from this point of view, value is produced by labour itself, not through exchange. It's a really key difference. So surplus value here is the extra stuff that the workers make and the owner then takes it as profit. What the photo is there is the nets underneath factories in China that make iPhones, where the working conditions were so bad that people were jumping off the buildings to commit suicide. Rather than fix the terrible working conditions, the company put up nets to try and stop their workers committing suicide. I think this is like it's not even really a metaphor, a key symbol of like this kind of very exploitative relationship that we have throughout the world today in terms of who makes our technology. So, in terms of this system, capitalist extraction of surplus value is evident in some of these contemporary developments today. Governments are under constant pressure to keep wages down, and you can see the kind of reduction in union power over the past 20 or 30 years that kind of help people act together and keep their wages relative to cost of living. Working days have been extended. Also, work has been made more precarious, more part-time. So there's this kind of interesting juxtaposition now that those with full-time work kind of work more hours than ever before, and those with part-time work are often working like 3 or 4 jobs to try and get above subsistence wages. This increasing pressure to do everything more quickly, and technology is a good example of that, and shoving them and AI and everything's a good example. Fordism, that de-skilling, that splitting everything into micro-tasks has certainly happened in production realms, and more recently the huge billions of dollars being spent trying to replace workers with machines and algorithms and AI. So again, some of the things that Marx predicted here were kind of have played out. He also predicted that the growth of the growth of the middle class, though, was kind of challenged some of Marx's ideas. Marx thought that basically things would get so bad for the workers that they would unite and overthrow capitalism and move towards a communist or socialist society. That hasn't happened, and I spoke in earlier lectures about the Frankfurt School that have some kind of ideas about consumer society around that. But there's definitely been a growth of middle class, and many of those theorists kind of point out that like we've been kind of tricked to be consumers and like have been distracted by shiny things such as entertainment and iPhones or whatever that kind of has replaced religion as the opiate of the masses, and we're just kind of rewarded now with just enough to get by to be able to kind of have those kind of things that we want and be able to kind of not starve. So this growth of the middle class is a kind of challenge to some of Marx's ideas. He argued that we would develop a class consciousness through the kind of our process of alienation, and then we would all kind of rise together. That this would develop amongst the working class, a necessary development in order for them to recognise their own exploitation and to rise up and overthrow capitalism. Now, Marxist revolutions haven't really happened organically like that. Communist countries throughout the 20th century didn't really have a kind of working class-led revolutions. They tended to be kind of led by elitists, kind of imposing Marxist thought on the populace. And again, there's been lots of interesting concepts about why Marx was maybe wrong or why this hasn't happened in that sense. But interestingly, there kind of Marx is associated with kind of failure of communism and kind of communist violence and that kind of thing. But really, Marx's ideas, if we separate them from some of the ways they were kind of utilised and maybe exploited themselves in different parts of the world, were fundamentally idealistic. He thought that like people would eventually move towards creating a system that would be best for them. And so his critique of capitalism, therefore, was meant to kind of sow the seeds of revolution in that sense. Not so much like Weber, who's a much more kind of negative The negative understanding thought we'd end up living in an iron cage of rationality. But he also was interested in class relations as well, and he kind of criticised and built on Marx's model to kind of talk about how social stratification is not simply just about economic relations per se. It's also shaped by things like social status and the relationship to what he called party. Weber was particularly interested in how people kind of engage with each other with what he called the market, and that kind of conflict and creativity happened through those negotiations. For Weber, the market represents the arena in which people come together as both either buyers and sellers, and with the particular resources they already possess. So an individual's class situation in this sense does reflect their economic resources, which can be sold in the market to earn rewards as income and good working conditions, but it also kind of relies upon their kind of cultural and status and symbolic elements as well that I'll go into in a sec. Weber introduced the idea of life chances, which is a term that's kind of used quite widely today, and pointed out that people in different class situations, it's not just about their relation to means of production in terms of the life they can live, but also about what resources they have. So he starts to kind of, I suppose, split up what Marx saw as the working class into kind of more specific groups, and to think about the different forms of inequalities and different forms of opportunities that those people have. So people on that class ladder have different life chances. And what they have in terms of what they can bring to the market might be inheritance, might be property, business, it might be knowledge, skills, education. They might have access to the right people, whether that's unions or professionals, accreditation, and other people, and people, powerful people that they know. Things like gender, race, ethnicity, and age play a role in how people's life chances work out as well. So in this sense, class, through this Weberian lens, is not just this singular thing of like owner of a mean of production or not. It's more complex and multidimensional. People come together and for multiple reasons, to multiple ends. They also kind of argue and struggle against each other for multiple reasons as well. So Weber starts talking about more than two classes, different people in different market situations, and therefore people throughout the system have different life chances based on their resources. It isn't just about economics, it's also about other things. He referred to life chances as the differential access to supports such as education, wealth, housing, and health based on a person's status resources. So he develops the concept of social class here to describe how individuals combine their property and marketable skills in the market situation to bargain and gain from these processes for better life chances. So he's not denying that there's exploitation or alienation happening here. He's kind of pointing out more complexity in terms of the way this kind of happens on a more micro interactional level in day-to-day life. This is Weber's model of classes. You can see that rather than just the two, he has this kind of more rungs on the ladder in the sense. The ruling class is still there, but like there's intelligentsia, professionals, highly educated white class workers, but also more professionals such as doctors, lawyers, accountants, the petty bourgeoisie, small business owners, self-employed tradesmen, shopkeepers, the working class. It's also split up as well. It's well-organised occupations with miners and skilled trades, and there's kind of factory workers, casual workers, unemployed, kind of low-skill stuff at the bottom. Weber introduces the idea of status into class, where Marx kind of points out the class relations is objective. It's all about the relations of production and economic measures. Weber has much more subjective elements. Differences between social groups around honour and prestige, and the way that they're thought about by other groups. So where classes are economically determined in Marx, these kind of status groups are more kind of culturally and symbolically allocated. Status groups are around how people share different kind of lifestyles and characteristics and interests that aren't necessarily just about money and economy. But status groups can be both used to include and exclude. People with particular characteristics could be based on race, neighbourhood, gender, could be based on tastes, morals, could be based on sport, all kinds of different aspects of status. A key example, is the difference in labour and status between white and blue collar. White collar workers seen as more higher status, blue collar workers seen as lower status, largely because white collar is seen to be like done with the brain and intellectual, where blue collar work is done with the body. But these are largely arbitrary categories. It doesn't seem to relate all that much to the actual value and use of the jobs. the silly quip that I say all the time is I would say that, like, people that collect the garbage are more useful in society and actually create less damage than, say, lawyers that, through David Graeber's lens and bullshit jobs kind of actually cause a lot of alienation and a lot of problems in the world. You can see these kind of status differences, throughout the labour market all the way, but you can also see it, in terms of like taste and stuff like that. How different groups, different kind of classes in that rung before have different interests, whether that's like footy or the opera and all that kind of stuff. And I'll talk about that when I do the stuff on Bourdieu in the next part. The other important concept that Weber introduces is the concept of party. This isn't just political party, voting blocks and social movements. It's more about like the way people organise in society around different interests, different things. And like we'll do a whole section later in the course on social movements that kind of relate to some of this. People have different interests and they might therefore organise to do things and try and put those interests into practice. And things like status are important about this. In this sense, like, politics these days is not just about like how much money you earn. It's not just about, getting a good job and taxes and stuff like that. There's things like feminism and the Greens and family first parties that are more about kind of cultural elements. So again, this is a kind of challenge to the kind of exclusively economic idea of class from Marx, where Weber shows there's all these kind of cultural association, community kind of aspects of it as well. Weber, importantly, as part of how class would develop and as how more urban, complex societies would develop, saw that the rise of bureaucrats and bureaucracy in general would be important to organise society efficiently. There's a kind of functionalist element in terms of the need here for bureaucrats to kind of run society to, keep things efficient. But he also saw a negative aspect of that as this would become more and more normal and bureaucratic mindset would therefore leak into more and more aspects of society, that we would increasingly be kind of dehumanised in our relations with each other. So this wouldn't just be through the kind of class inequalities, it's through institutional relations as well. What he kind of means here is like, if you're at university, you have a student number that represents you. If you ever had to deal with Centrelink, you would feel that dehumanised thing going on there. As societies become more rationalised, this means he saw that societies would be kind of trapped in what he called the iron cage of rationality. Some typical lovely quotes there from Weber. It's horrible to think that the world would one day be filled with little cogs, little men clinging to little jobs and striving towards bigger ones. Weber didn't think that this was going to go so well. So the iron cage of rationality shows that unlike Marx's more kind of idealistic notion that like while things are unequal and alienating and exploitative now, they're likely to move to a more equal thing in the future, Weber had a much more negative view of what was going to come. People will be small cog in a ceaselessly moving mechanism which prescribes to him an essentially fixed route of march. The usual kind of sexist language there from the 1800s as well. So interesting to hear how you think about these kind of comparisons, whether you think Marx or Weber is more right, or which concepts that they developed are more useful for today, and you have kind of an essay that's all on this to write about this stuff. There's another quote from Weber there you can read as well. So to compare the two, to conclude this bit, Marx was interested in broad structures, kind of a global big picture. Weber was more interested in kind of more case study, everyday relations. Marx saw class as objective, related to the material. Weber's more subjective, related to the symbolic and cultural as well. Capitalist mode of production versus more kind of everyday life chances and market situations. Marx is definitely economically determinist. How we produce things is what matters, where Weber's more interested in the interaction of production and consumption and what happens in the market. For Marx, ideology means that people fit the structure and is relatively deterministic. For Weber, there's still elements of that in Weberian kind of understandings of class, but he brings status more central to understanding how class relations work. As I said, Weber has a much more negative sketch of the future in terms of the iron cage of rationality than Marx's more utopian communism. There's a couple of little cartoon explainer videos there that you can kind of have a look at to conclude this section.